Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to this special edition of LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our co-host this evening, the Center for American Studies at Columbia University. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. American democracy has undergone an extraordinary stress test. Where do we stand now? What issues, controversies, flashpoints will shape the future course of our democratic experiment? And what can our tradition of American political writings tell us about what lies ahead? These are the guiding questions for tonight's distinguished panel. This event marks publication of American Democracy, 21 Historic Answers to 5 Urgent Questions, a new Library of America collection edited by Nicholas Lemann, who joins us tonight. The panelists will talk for about 45 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're calling from. Now, here to introduce the panel, please welcome the Director of Columbia Center for American Studies, Professor Casey Blake.
Thank you, Max. I'm Casey Blake, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Center for American Studies at Columbia University. The faculty and students at the center find inspiration in John Dewey's dictum that democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. In its curriculum, community partnerships, and public programming, the center seeks to bring historical perspective and civic imagination to bear on issues of urgent public concern. And I dare say no issue is more urgent than the one our panelists will address tonight. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank Max Rudin and the Library of America for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and the Jack Miller Center for its generous support for this and our other public programs. We're fortunate to have an extraordinary panel joining us this evening. Patrick Deneen is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, where he holds the David A. Potenziani Memorial College Chair in Constitutional Studies. E.J. Dionne is Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, a professor of government at Georgetown University, and an opinion columnist at the Washington Post. Nicole is a political historian and associate research scholar with the Obama Presidency Oral History Project at Columbia. Michele Moody-Adams is the Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia, as well as the chair of Columbia's Philosophy Department. Moderating this evening's discussion is Nicholas Lemann, who is the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism at Columbia, as well as the Director of Columbia's World Projects. So thanks to all of the participants for joining us. And with that, I will turn things over to Professor Lemann.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Max. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is a fairly short book with a very long gestation period. And I won't get into all the reasons why, but it was notable to me that when Max and I first agreed that I would do this book, I wasn't noticing a lot of conversation about these fundamental questions of, is democracy in America functioning as it should? By the time we restarted it and ran down the home stretch to publication, that topic seemed to be all anybody was talking about. So that makes the book late but unintentionally timely. I also want to briefly thank one person at the Library of America, which is Derek Schilling, who did yeoman work to bring this book out, along with other people, but mostly Derek. So I want to start by asking two panelists, Nicole and Patrick, just to help us define terms. So I'm going to sort of spray you with a few questions and answer as you wish. Is the United States a democracy? Was it founded as a democracy? Did it become a democracy and then become a wobbly democracy, as many people seem to think? So Nicole, why don't you start on those small questions?
Sure, they're just tiny ones, so it should be a brief answer. For all of the talk of the US being a republic, not a democracy, it actually is both of those things. It's a republic and a democracy, and it's been a democracy from its founding. And the things that we would use to describe a healthy democracy today, I think would be legible to the founders in the 18th century. Things like regular elections, equality before the law, an independent judiciary, encouragement of free speech and free association, freedom from arbitrary force from the state. I think the thing that they wouldn't recognize is who all has access to that. And that question of democracy for who is the big dividing line, I think, in many of the debates about democracy. And your book is actually really helpful for this because you see in the very first document, George Washington talking to a Jewish congregation. And he's talking about how amazing the United States is because the government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And Washington truly believed that. But the very next document is Frederick Douglass and What to the Slave is the 4th of July, in which he says, your celebrations of independence are grotesque, given that you enslave millions of people. And so that I think democracy would be legible, who has access to it, and how much we depend on the near universal access to all of those different things to define a healthy democracy. That I think would surprise a lot of people in the 18th century.
Patrick.
Yeah, I suppose I'll take a somewhat more contrarian view to the question, which is that I think it's. I would have been happier in some ways had the question of whether a democracy been more centrally a part of the volume, and in particular, the question of what is. The book begins with the question of what is who is a citizen, but in many ways I think it would have been interesting and perhaps necessary to discuss what is citizenship, and I think in that aspect we might have to conclude that America is at least problematically defined as a democracy. If by democracy we take the kind of definition you see, for example, in Tocqueville in Democracy in America, in which he defines democracy as the kind of active engagement in political rule. And more than that, the way in which citizenship shapes and changes who we are as civic personas. So the actual engagement in civic life doesn't leave us where we were when we entered civic life. As he puts it in one of his chapters, the heart is enlarged as a consequence of our engagement with fellow citizens. So I think in many ways, the American Republic, and it was defined as a republic, was defined precisely to make that part of citizenship extremely difficult, and quite intentionally so. The founding fathers, Madison in Federalist 10, which wasn't in this volume, but there's only so much you can do. But Madison's quite explicit. He wants to create a republic, not a democracy, precisely because a democracy he views as the kind of regime that leads to too much civic engagement, too much caring about the public sphere. And so there was a kind of way of shaping the American regime that would be more privatistic. People would be inclined to view their private lives as central and their public lives as really secondary and as a kind of afterthought. And also to draw, Madison makes an argument in Federalist 10 and elsewhere, to draw especially the kind of people to the ruling offices who would be drawn to the kind of ambitious projects that they hope America would be engaged in. And so what struck me is that some of the subsequent questions that you asked, the urgent questions, it seems to me are a direct consequence of this aspect of the American Republic that we call a democracy. You have, for example, a selection from Paul Nietzsche, NSC 68, that lays out the American vision of how it would proceed during the Cold War against Russia. And the more the United States has become a kind of empire, the more difficult it is for us to say that we are in some real sense a self-governing republic. So much of what we do now as a nation is really engaged in this kind of trying to run the world. And the more that happens, the more difficult it is to say that ordinary citizens, in a sense, run the show. And we can point to Rome as an example of a regime that called itself a republic long after Augustus Caesar became emperor. And I was also struck that your last section talks about the central importance of protest as an essential feature of democracy. And you actually have a wonderful excerpt from Hannah Arendt's essay on civil disobedience. Arendt, in the course of that essay, in some of the spots that you quoted her and some that were not, in part emphasizes that protest can not only be a sign of a kind of health of democracy, but also a kind of disease or dis-ease of democracy, that it's especially when people feel voiceless, that they are not actually able to act and engage as citizens, that they're more likely to engage in the kind of, let's say, less verbal form of, or less give and take form of political engagement in the form of protest, as opposed to the kind of listening, speaking, engaging, and potentially being changed and transformed that democratic citizenship should encourage. So when I think about the last 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, I think of us as less democratic in precisely those terms that Tocqueville warned us about, that as we became more individualistic, more privatistic, more imperial, more engaged in commerce, the less we would be actually engaged together as democratic citizens, and the kind of resulting cacophony and mutual ire and even hatred that we see in our nation today seems to me to be a reflection of this crisis of democracy.
Thanks. And I'll take this and sort of put it to Michele immediately, particularly, well, a few things, but the one I want to start with is the question of the central government of the United States. And what Patrick has said is interesting, because in the book, there's a couple of selections, a speech by Theodore Roosevelt and a speech by Franklin Roosevelt, and Nietzsche's document that you referred to, that I thought of as really making a case that the United States needs a much bigger active government. I think, if I'm not being unfair to you, Patrick, not a fan of a very big central government, you would say the original sin occurred much earlier in the Federalist Papers, right? So is there, Michele, this sort of tension between the notion of citizenship and the notion of a strong, active central government?
Well, that tension actually, Nicholas, gets expressed, I think, in the Thoreau essay of civil disobedience, where he's telling us that for him, protest isn't so much about being voiceless, but about giving voice to one's conscience and one's sense that you never resign your conscience to the legislator. And you're not protesting as a way of expressing respect for law, as, say, a king, or even in a different way, a person acting on Arendt's principles might be. You're expressing your sense of what is right and holding your government and any other institutions to the test of what is right. But on the question of government itself, I mean, I want to push back a little bit. I'm not somebody who loves large government, but one of the things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did do, and he started doing it in 1931, even when he was still governor of New York, is understanding that there might be some dimensions of our ability to be good citizens that was undermined by economic hardship, by an inability to have regular employment and to save for one's old age. And he's starting in 31, and then again in the speech in the Commonwealth Club here in the book, he's starting to say there may be goods that are central to American democratic life that some people will be denied access to if we don't start thinking differently about the role that government could play in our lives. If 1/3 of America is out of work and 1/3 can't afford to put food on their table, is there some way in which the stability of American political life might be dependent on government taking a somewhat more active role?
EJ, I want to ask you, I guess I feel like I'm sort of teasing our participants because I think what everybody really wants to know is democracy in America endangered right now? Do you think it is? I feel like, I mean, I think you and I are the oldest people on the panel, and I feel like I've heard that question discussed more in the last 5 years than ever before. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, I agree with that. Could I just go back to the beginning for just a
Yeah,
moment?
of course.
Because I think your opening question is really important about whether we are a democracy or a republic, that old argument and what that means. And I actually think we have been arguing about inclusion and to the extent to which democracy really depends upon a commitment to the equal dignity of every person and the equal participation of every person. And when you look at political arguments in our country, how people went back to the beginning and read the promise of the founding documents had a lot to do with how politics went forward. I think it's very important that you've got both Lincoln and Martin Luther King in the book, because Lincoln's whole political career in many ways was created by this, it's not in the book, but the speech at Cooper Union, where as part of his argument with Stephen Douglas, he argued that actually the founders envisioned the ultimate extinction of slavery. And his the whole trajectory of his rhetoric at Gettysburg in the second inaugural was toward a declaration that we were on a path toward equal inclusion, towards something that was democratic. The key words being we the people, all men are created equal, and all government is based upon the consent of the governed. And Martin Luther King did exactly the same thing. The I Have a Dream speech is his great line about the promissory note that came back marked unpaid insufficient funds. He argued that from the beginning, there was a promise of democratic equality, and we have been struggling for that all the way through. And that's kind of, I have, if you will, maybe you might say a dewy-eyed view of democracy, D-E-W-E-Y, but it really is a view that sees this trajectory in a greater assertion of equal participation, basically, throughout our history. And it's also a Barack Obama view. That's what the Selma speech was about, which if this book could be twice as long, you would have probably included that. It's an excellent book, by the way. Just briefly on your question, I am with you. I've never heard democracy, talk of the threat to democracy voiced in the same way that we have in recent years. And I think the answer to the question is yes and no. Unfortunately, I hate to be equivocal. It's no, we actually largely got through this. We preserved free speech. There was a free press. There was a right to protest. We just had an election, a free election, with the largest participation we've had since 1900. We actually, because of the pandemic, facilitated participation in the election. We made voting easier, which voters responded to on both sides of politics. Trump got 11 million more votes than he got the last time. Joe Biden got 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton got. And that wasn't just because fewer people didn't vote for third parties. On the other hand, I think we saw at the very end of this period how badly things could go in the way Donald Trump behaved after the election. Not only the refusal to accept the outcome, but the persistent lies about the outcome, the effort to toss votes out arbitrarily. And somehow those votes seem to come especially from places like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee, places that happen to be places he lost, but also places with large numbers of African Americans, culminating in the attack on the Capitol, and the first time in our history that the Confederate flag was paraded through the Capitol. In the end, I think we're fortunate that Trump was an incompetent authoritarian, and that we were saved in many ways by his incompetence. and that we still have to look at places like Hungary with Viktor Orban, or places like Turkey with Erdogan, where a more competent authoritarian than Trump could have used our institutions to undermine democracy even more than he did. So that's the no part. I think, thank goodness, thank God, democracy held enough that we could have a free election and a real peaceful transfer of power despite that moment.
Let me pull out a couple of strands that I hear around me in the debate that are sort of, more constitutional questions, but teed up somewhat by the Trump administration. And just ask you, and I won't ask anybody in particular, to sort of dive in, if you would, to ask about these in the larger context of American democracy. So one is the idea that the United States is insufficiently majoritarian in the way the political system is set up. And the bill of indictment, the Senate is structured so that a minority of the US population can get a majority in the Senate. House districts to some extent have that problem. The Electoral College has that problem. So do we need, or if you could abolish democracy for a day and make yourself monarch and use that day to make democracy better and then step down, would you change any of that? Michele?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the worries about the Electoral College and the way the Senate is elected. But I also think that, this is the thought of somebody like John Rawls in The Theory of Justice, that when you have a kind of robust tradition of social protest, which the end of this volume, I think, nicely helps us understand, you do have a capacity for a well-functioning democracy to actually have a form of self-correction. That's certainly the way Martin Luther King's defense of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, might be seen. And it turns out that some of the parts of government, as imperfect as it might be structurally, that King counted on, like the Supreme Court, to help, enact a kind of commitment to equality, for instance, in education, and then the Congress to enact the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. For all of its imperfections, it turned out that American democracy actually had internal to itself the capacity for stabilizing itself, for self-correction. And for, we all may want to change something about the Constitution, but I would be reluctant to change anything that undermined the capacity of social movements who may, as Patrick said, may feel voiceless at some point, and they are able to express their voice, to be able to appeal to something beyond themselves, shared democratic values that we think of as embodied in these institutions that have lasted, however imperfectly, over time. And I'll just say one final thing. Democracy is intrinsically a fragile thing. Plato understood this in Book 8 of the Republic. The question is whether we can design a democracy, as I think, maybe not as intentionally as some others argue, but as I think our founding fathers did, to design a democracy that actually contained within itself this capacity for self-correction. And I'm hoping that we can pull ourselves back from this brink that we are on the edge of right now. I think the capacity for America to do that actually still is contained in its institutions.
Could I say quickly, first of all, I salute Michele on the self-correction point, which is one of the things I most love about our history, is that I think it is a history of struggle and self-correction. So I agree with that. And I'm too much of a small R Republican or small D Democrat, and I believe in original sin. So I would never want me to be a monarch or anyone else. But if you ask the question about flaws in our system, the answer is yes. We already changed the Electoral College once when it blew up. I think our founders were actually far more constitutionally adventurous and prepared to look at their own creation and say, we got that wrong, or we got that slightly wrong. And that we have willy-nilly changed the Electoral College in practice because we weren't even in the original design supposed to elect the electors by popular vote. And so now we have a system that I think is utterly flawed because it tries to be small d democratic by electing electors, but can produce outcomes. And because of movements in the population, will produce those outcomes more and more frequently where the winner of the electoral college is out of sync with the popular vote. So I think that is a problem. And yes, although the Constitution makes it almost impossible, I would radically alter the United States Senate. When the Republic was created, the ratio between the population ratio between the smallest and the largest state was 13-1. It's now somewhere over 70-1. The states, we had the 13 original states that signed that compact. We've let in states since then and drawn their boundaries for all kinds of political reasons at a particular moment. And so now, you know, we have a gerrymandered Senate, courtesy of the Constitution. So those are two areas that I would change. And I'll throw one radical idea on the table, which actually isn't that radical. Australians do it. It's a which is a fairly conservative society. I am for what my friend Miles Rappaport and I have been calling universal civic duty voting. I would like us to adopt an Australian system, compulsory attendance at the polls. I actually think it would help create some of the virtues that Patrick was underscoring in terms of bringing every citizen into the electoral process. But I'm not going to hijack the discussion to defend universal civic duty voting. But I think that would be an improvement on the current system.
I have a couple other sort of systemic questions. I want to pivot a little bit, but ask Patrick and Nicole this time to respond. This is kind of the opposite question from the one I just asked about, are we insufficiently responsive to the majority? And that is, are we too insufficiently protective of civil servants and scientific experts and people like that in the government? This was a common worry during the Trump administration. And you see this in the book, this sort of tension around there'd be a wave of popular empowerment and establishment of political machines and political parties, and then it'd be a wave of quote unquote reform, trying to prevent the over-politicization of sort of technical or expert functions in government. So have we got a problem somewhere on that dimension? Either we're too political, too meddling with bureaucrats and experts and civil servants, or too dominated by elites, experts, et cetera. So do you all have comments on that?
You know, it's an interesting question, particularly in this moment, because I do think that the past 5 years have shifted people's perspective on this question in a way that I don't know is helpful. I think there is now a reflexive response to say, you know, trust the experts, trust science, trust these things in a way that people who are liberals and on the left have traditionally questioned some of those things, particularly in the last several decades, to think about expertise as important, but not impregnable, right? That we should be able to, that we understand that expertise often protects people in power, often protects people who are elites, and shuts out voices from below, right? Grassroots voices. So I think that we would benefit from not being so reflexive when we talk about expertise, being more nuanced in that conversation. I don't think that, you know, a political appointee who is basically simply going to be doing self-dealing is the best person to run a major bureaucracy. I think that for some people, this would be good evidence for why we should have smaller bureaucracies. So there is absolutely a role for expertise and for science and for technical solutions, but that can't be the only authority to which the only authority that we acknowledge.
Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, of course, for America's future, but also as part of America's past. when I teach in a department of political science, it was, this department and this discipline was given that name during the creation of these kinds of disciplines during the Progressive era. And the belief was that through the study of human phenomenon, in this case, political phenomenon, where sociology was social phenomenon or economic phenomenon, we could create the kind of objective knowledge, the body of objective knowledge that would give us determinative truths about human behavior in a similar way that natural scientists were discovering about the natural world. And many of my predecessors in the discipline of political science were quite explicit that once we had this knowledge, we would no longer need to be a democracy. One of the presidents of the American Political Science Association, I wrote about him in my book called Democratic Faith. He actually said, he came out in his presidential speech to the Political Science Association and said, once we have this knowledge, and we're on the verge of it now, we can dismiss needing to appeal to the people any longer. And he said, and the leader who seems to really get this the most is this guy in Italy named Benito Mussolini. This is the guy that we
throw in
really,
here.
yeah, well, this is the guy we really need to be looking at. So
Here at Columbia, we had Ernest Burgess,
Yeah.
who, in addition to all of what you said, was a major eugenicist. So
yeah. Well,
we're experts.
So precisely. So I think we need, right now, interestingly, the heirs of the progressive era, which tend to be today the people who are most urgently expressing the need to defer to the experts, need to be self-conscious of the ways in which this deference to the experts has a very checkered past. And indeed, it's a past that has been used against democracy, against what's seen as the dim-witted, backward views of the many, the unwashed masses who really just need to be guided and led by their betters. So I think it's a perilous path to be on. I think there needs to be a lot more reflection here. I want to echo Nicole, a lot more reflection about the appropriate relationship between expertise in a democracy, its relationship to public opinion, where the sort of public is, and the role of the politician or even the statesman in negotiating what can sometimes be a bit of a tension.
Could I just share, I happen to have next to me, for something I was working on earlier today, something Isaiah Berlin said on this question, which I thought really got it right, because I agree with where Nicole and Patrick were going, in the sense that science too is certain facts are facts. And when scientists say X is clearly X and not Y, we should defer to their expertise. But what you do with that knowledge is a political question. What Isaiah Berlin said is there are vast regions of reality which only scientific methods, hypotheses, established truths can reveal, account for, explain, and indeed control. So yes, God bless the scientists. Then Berlin went on to say, not everything in practice can be grasped by the sciences. Natural science cannot answer all questions. And it seems to me that's the right balance. I think we got into a crazy argument about mask wearing. We should have listened to the scientists on mask wearing, for example. But the phrase, listen to the science, all by itself shouldn't be dispositive. We should have a conversation about why we should listen to the science.
Michele.
Yeah, so the subtitle of this session is The Task Before Us, and that's a clear reference to Dewey, obviously, that wonderful essay, Creative Democracy, The Task Before Us. Dewey was, I think, really right on the mark on this. I mean, he was in this kind of debate with Walter Lippmann, Lippmann saying that we weren't capable anymore of knowing enough or caring enough about the world outside of us as individuals. And Dewey saying, no, that's just not true. Of course, we need experts. But the expert can't tell you where the shoe pinches. They can help you create a new shoe and tell you how to produce it more effectively and more efficiently. But if you want to know where the shoe pinches, only the citizens can tell you that. And I think that Dewey and pragmatism, as a distinctively American contribution to this worry, might be the place to look. I would add that there are traditions of things like citizen assemblies, people like James Fishkin, political philosopher, who have shown that if you get ordinary people and you sit them down in a room and you give them sufficient amount of knowledge about the data and the facts and so forth that count, they will take up the challenge of trying to address. You have to make it small enough. And I think this is going to be, if you are interested in answering this question, the task before us, how can we, as we take science seriously on these large questions about, you know, pandemics and viruses and horrible diseases, but how on questions that might matter to people at the local level, how could we enlist them in helping to reshape the democracy that we share, and in fact, to reshape their own ability and strengthen their own capacity to act as effective political agents within it. I actually look to Dewey for that. And I love the fact that we have that subtitle from Dewey as sort of framing this session.
Let me stick with you, Michele, and ask another one of these mega questions about how our democracy is doing, and invite all the rest of you to chime in. But I'll start with you, since you've been praising the tradition of protest and social movements. So we had an inauguration not long ago, and our new president kept praising unity. So you have this sort of apposition in the public conversation now of unity, a good thing on one side, and hyper-partisanship or polarization on the other side. Is that a correct way to frame it? Is that a problem? And if it is a problem, what do we do about it? What's the task before us there?
I think that's a fascinating question. The word unity can be both a negative
Right.
concept and not so negative. I prefer commonality. I think it allows for the acknowledgement that it is partly the heterogeneity of America, ethnically, from a religious standpoint, you know, national origin and so forth, that's made us a rich and productive country when we've been such. I understand the argument about unity, but you know, that idea of e pluribus unum did often get used as a kind of stick against people who might be trying to bring their differences in a constructive way to help shape American public life. So as much as I appreciate the wish to stop the division and to stop the violence, I think the language of unity might be actually masking the tendency to use that concept in a way that suppresses difference and suppresses variety and heterogeneity.
You know, what's
Anyone else?
interesting, what's
Nicole?
interesting about the inaugural address is, of course, he used the word unity so often, but Biden actually used the word democracy more than any other president at the inaugural in history. And that, I think, is not unrelated to this question of unity or commonality. Unity, I think, in that vision is not everyone agreeing on the same thing, but agreeing on this idea of a pro-democracy sort of consensus, and that democracy and the structures and institutions of democracy are how you work out that unity and those differences in ways that are much less destructive than what we saw in the months prior. And you know, that democracy problem, you asked earlier if this was just a thing from the last 5 years or so. I mean, I think that it's been something that there's been a real struggle with, particularly in the last 10 years or so, but really over the past 50 years, as part of the country has seen democracy as more universalist and more majoritarian, and part of the country hasn't. And so we might all be able to unite around this concept of democracy. I'm not sure we all mean the same thing by it, which is part of the stumbling block.
I'm just going to keep cycling through these big questions that I see teed up, and I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A and sort of obliquely referring to some of them. For those of us on the panel who are journalists, you know, another strain is this idea, and it maps onto some of what we've been talking about. It maps onto Lemann and Dewey arguing in the 1920s, onto the question about experts, is the idea that misinformation is destroying the integrity of American democracy. EJ and I are all about presenting real information, of course, but we hear tell that there are colleagues of ours who spread misinformation. And there's a sort of, as with many topics in the public conversation, there's this sort of 20-year rule 20 years ago, everything was fine, but now we're awash in misinformation, and democracy can't function because of that. So is that a fair critique of the current situation? Is there anything to be done about it? Do we sacrifice free speech at the altar of reality-based politics? So who wants to take that on?
But I want to go to Dewey. I'm so grateful Michele is Dewey-eyed too, that the great Lippmann-Dewey debate over journalism, I would summarize, and a great Columbia scholar did this long before me, that, in a way, Lippmann said information came first. You got the information, then you made judgments publicly. Dewey essentially argued that democratic engagement itself created the thirst for information, and that by being engaged, you then sought out information. I've always leaned toward the Dewey side, but I've also said that we kind of need a bit of a Lippmannite system of journalism in order to properly realize Dewey's hopes. Now, we can't be romantic about some journalistic era that for most of our history, as you know, Nick, and everybody at Columbia knows, we had partisan newspapers. If you look around the country, there are lots of newspapers with Republican or Democrat or Whig in the title. I once told my syndicate I wanted to be in every Whig paper left in America. And that, that signaled a time when the press was highly partisan. And we really only went over to this new system with the Pulitzers, with the realization that you could make money by selling to a broad audience and not just to a partisan audience. And then got Lippmannite rules that lasted until maybe 20, 25 years ago. Now, I think one of the issues, so I've always wanted a kind of peaceful coexistence between the old, it's not that old, to the Lippmannite quest for truth and facts with an engaging form of journalism that is partisan. And in my ideal world, the two would coexist. I think what we've had trouble with is in this technological world of ours, it makes it possible to spread the truth more quickly than ever, but it also makes it easier to disseminate lies more widely and more efficiently than ever. And as many have said, it does make it easier for us if we want to, and the algorithms help to avoid conflicting arguments or conflicting facts. So that is a problem that we have to deal with. But I certainly do not want to get, I'm an opinion journalist after all these days. I certainly do not want to get rid of argument. I think disagreement is one of the joys of democracy. So how do you marry the great Dewey aspirations with Lippmann's aspirations? And I think that's the struggle we're in right now.
I'm going to speed forward because there's other topics I want to cover and our time is starting to run short. So another series of questions that we've gotten, and it's very much an element in the book as well, is this is a periodic critique of American democracy, and it's definitely queued up now, is the idea that our democracy doesn't function properly because of the power of money. That is, elites, the 1%, large corporations, mega donors, whatever you want to call it, have a kind of thumb on the scales. And a pertinent text here is Justice Stevens' dissent in the Citizens United case. Is this a problem, an existential problem? And if it is, what do we do about it? Patrick, can you answer?
Sure. I mean, well, that actually is one of the, strikingly, one of the consequences of becoming, in the vision of Federalist 10, which I mentioned earlier, becoming a very powerful and wealthy nation, is that the more and more power, wealth, influence in the economy, influence in the, what Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex, the more of that runs through Washington, D.C., inevitably, the more money you're just going to have awash in that system, and in some ways, it would be near miraculous to come up with any solution to this problem. that, even if we were able to create good campaign finance laws, and I think we do need much better campaign finance laws, money will find its way in these kinds of flows with the kind of power we're talking about in these centers.
I forget which political scientist coined this phrase. Maybe you'll remember the hydraulic theory of politics. You know that phrase?
I remember when I read it, but it's been a long time. EJ, do you remember?
I remember it too, and I can't place it.
Let me link this question to an earlier question, which is about whether democracy needs to be more majoritarian. And I want to issue a caution that there is no perfect system. One of my favorite essays in American political science is by a Princeton professor that Woodrow Wilson hired named Henry Jones Ford. And it was against the primary. It was against political primaries. And he was like one of the only political scientists in that era in the 1920s and 30s who was against the political primary because everybody thought this is going to solve the problem of money in politics. Finally, we're going to get all of that ugly influence of that back, smoke-filled back room of the political bosses. We're going to air out democracy and it will solve all the problems. And Henry Jones Ford wrote this really powerful essay in which he argued, guess what? What's going to happen is you're going to get candidate-centered campaigning. It's going to draw massive amounts of money to advertising. The information that will be conveyed about these candidates will become canned and flat and really uninformative. You will draw celebrities as opposed to really substantive people. I mean, to the letter, this essay that was written in 1930 something really, it seemed to me, captured brilliantly, anticipated the solution to the problem, what people thought was the solution to the problem of politics. We know, for example, from California, the California initiative and referendum system, that where it's majoritarian, where it's sort of just full-on majoritarian, that's get 50 plus 1% of the vote for a decision, that these are subject to massive manipulation by powerful institutions through advertising, through through all kinds of use of their position, power, and wealth. So I think the idea that somehow we can get the money or the influence of money out of politics by, in some ways, giving more power to majorities is really problematic. And here, actually, I want to give a shout out to my former colleague at Georgetown and EJ's current colleague, Michael Kazin, who wrote a wonderful biography of William Jennings Bryan, a godly hero, many years ago. And Bryan, I didn't realize this until I read the book, but Bryan thought that the creation of the Federal Reserve was something that was necessary. He supported it. But he was fearful that creating the Federal Reserve would simply give a lot of power to, guess what, to bankers. It would just be completely dominated by the sort of New York City financial set. And so he proposed, what if we instead we designate certain chairs? And this kind, you see this still, like there's a St. Louis, Fed chair, and there's different regional chairs. But we designate each chair to a kind of to what the old-fashioned word would be an estate. We'll have a chair for the farmers, and we'll have a chair for labor, and we'll have a chair for industry, we'll have a chair for banking. So that the decisions that are made are not just to benefit or advantage the banking industry and the financial industry, but we'll actually have to take into account a kind of broad set of concerns and views across the entire country. And I think that what Henry Jones Ford was sort of warning about is that if you flatten out the democracy to this majoritarian sort of, to the isolated selves that Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about in that essay in your volume, the sort of what she talks about as this kind of completely emancipated, independent, self-dependent human being, that you weaken these kinds of associational ties that actually amplify the voices of people who may not have the wealth, who may not have the position and the status and the rank. And it's, to my mind, democracy really needs to be concerned about how do you create not a flattened political and electoral universe, but one that's more lumpy, one in which people who may not have access to the power and to the wealth are able to amplify their voices by collecting together, right? And we see this, of course, throughout American history in various movements. But in some ways, that it's not the worst thing that that's institutionalized. We may not like the way that it's institutionalized right now, but to allow some lumpiness in our politics is how we prevent the inevitable influence of money from completely overrunning the system.
Let me
Nick,
raise
could I just say
another, let
something?
me just stop everybody because I want to raise one more mega issue before we.
Nick, we haven't, first of all, I love lumpiness. Thank you. That's a great term. I just we haven't paid enough tribute to the book itself. I am so happy you included Stevens's dissent. May I read one sentence just to honor your book?
Okay.
They are two sentences. At bottom, the court's opinion is thus a rejection of the common sense of the American people who have recognized the need to prevent corporations from undermining self-government since the founding and who have fought against the distinctive corrupting potential of corporate electioneering since the days of Theodore Roosevelt. It is a strange time to repudiate that common sense. Bless you for including Stevens in the book.
So yet another mega critique of American democracy that's in the air, and it's always been in the air, but just intense lately, is around race. There's quite a number of selections in the book that address this. And I guess the way I would put it is running all through American history is one strand that says, yes, but there's a usable past in there for racial progress, which is the move that, say, Dr. King makes in the letter from Birmingham jail. And there's another strain that says, this is not a good system and it should not be regarded reverentially and more radical changes should be contemplated. Does anybody want to address that? Michele, you look like.
That's a big question. I mean, I'm going to actually, though, complicate the picture of King. The letter from Birmingham jail is not everything King believed about America and race. He had a lot of anger. He had some sort of revolutionary ideas. And if you read the final speech at the Riverside Church, the Beyond Vietnam, he was deeply critical of American values as they were expressed on the global scene, particularly in Vietnam, in our militarism, and in the materialism that shaped American life. So I would venture to say that virtually every African-American voice in this wonderful book is always more complicated than any single essay you might choose from them. You chose great essays. And I have to say, I actually think the King essay is good because it gives us his hopeful side, where he acknowledges there is a lot that has to be remedied. There is some redemption that might need to be left. You might need to leave space for that, and there may be need for apologies. And he doesn't talk reparations here, but I don't know that he was against them. But he's also very hopeful for the possibility of a community in which the formerly oppressed and many, though not all of the former oppressors, might be able to live together in a community that celebrated the dignity of everybody. And I think King actually draws on the best of the American tradition to tell us what kind of democratic institutions we might need to do that. So as I said, I would be cautious about attributing to any figure who's African-American, Du Bois or Douglass or King, that there's some one stance, because King was deeply critical. And the only thing I would have changed about the book is adding that Beyond Vietnam speech, because it portrays the richness of King's kind of critical approach to American democracy.
And I would add, like, there is that aspirational story that is often invoked that the Declaration represents, but the constitutional structures often come in for criticism, not just because they supported enslavement for so long, but because here we are some 250 years later, and they still haven't provided whatever avenues we need for there to be a system that isn't just equitable, but equal. Like that equality of opportunity has still not been achieved through this system. So you could understand why people who are reverential of those universalist ideas would be deeply skeptical of a system that has failed pretty dramatically to deliver upon them.
EJ and Patrick, I see both your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, this may not be essentially about the race question, but it goes to, at the heart of the question about race is the question about equality, and what is equality, and what do we aspire to? Nicole just mentioned a key way in which we think about equality, which I think is expressed in many of the readings in the section on equality. which is the aspiration for equality of opportunity. I think you see that, for example, in the Horace Mann essay on education, that education, the line that leapt out at me, that only education can counteract the tendency to the domination of capital and the servility of labor. That it can become what he calls a great equalizer, by which he means allowing or opening up opportunity for anyone who is able to take advantage of that situation. It seems to me it's in the short Lincoln selection as well. I think we're right now at a moment where there's a growing awareness that equality of opportunity, as we've certainly come to define it and practice it, is actually one of the deepest sources of profound inequality in our country today. And especially the way in which education is increasingly used, the way education is practiced, in which institutions like the institution I teach at, Columbia and elsewhere, Georgetown, those people tend to be the winners in our economic, social, political order. And those who don't get admission to those institutions by default are the losers. And this is not simply true of African Americans, Hispanics. This is becoming true across the entire population of the United States today. So we have a system that's increasingly, that it's aspirationally was to create a perfect system of equality of opportunity, which we know can be profoundly manipulated, as we've seen recently in the admissions scandal. But even if it were profoundly manipulated, it would still result in extraordinary inequalities in our society today. So it seems to me that when we think about equality, and even with the selections that you have, we need to increasingly think about what are the shortcomings of equality of opportunity, even if perfectly practiced, and how do we redress the inevitable inequalities that seem to result, that are really creating deep, deep stresses in our political, economic, and social order.
Max, are you here to tell us it's curfew?
Yeah, I'm afraid so, because it's been great listening to you all. Nick, did you want to do a final word, or?
I'll give EJ the final word because
Okay.
I see that he has a point to make.
Yeah, just very briefly. First of all, I think the book is really good in underscoring the linkage between actual inequality of condition and inequality of opportunity, and the two are linked. But I just wanted to go back to a letter from Birmingham jail, because I also think it makes Michele's point about anger and the fact that those who are oppressed get very impatient with those King talks to as white moderates. And he says, perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much. I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor class, oppressor race, can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race. I think what's powerful about that essay in this book is to remind us that we may kind of clean up King on holidays and say he was fundamentally moderate, and we may clean up other writers in this book and kind of forget that some of the anger and impatience that we see in politics now, and particularly around racial inequality, has been with us for a very long time. And King and Du Bois in this book make that very clear.
So Max, I'll just say, I can't remember what the first Library of America book to be published was in the early 80s, but I do remember buying it. And I'm very grateful to you for the whole project, as well as in this instance for understanding that, you know, classic American texts are not only valuable on their own and deserve to be preserved and disseminated, but also are pertinent to the present. And this book is published in that spirit.
Thanks, Nick. And we couldn't agree with you more about that. And thank you all. You've been listening to Patrick Deneen, EJ Dionne, Nicole Hemmer, Nicholas Lemann, and Michele Moody-Adams discuss American democracy, its bedrock touchstones, its stresses, and its flashpoints. Nick Lemann has just edited a new Library of America collection, American Democracy, 21 Historic Answers to 5 Urgent Questions. I hope that you will join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Thursday, February 18, it's Poet of the People, The Greatness of Langston Hughes, marking the centenary of Hughes' first published poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Please join Columbia's Brent Hayes Edwards and Rafia Zafar of Washington University for a conversation about Hughes' centrality for American literature and for international African diaspora culture, with readings from poets Kevin Young and Talia Himba-Jess. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's American Democracy and African American Poetry collections and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Nicholas Lemann and our panelists, and to Casey Blake and Columbia's Center for American Studies. Have a great evening.